Roughly 150 years ago, the theory of evolution radically changed how we viewed life on Earth. All species were said to have evolved from a common ancestor, instead of existing in their present forms for all eternity, or from a point of origin. At that time, and for decades after, many biologists took the view that the main driving force in evolution was simply random variations in gene frequency. All life as we know it was just an accident, driven by random variations in genes passed on to offspring. Many came to believe we were not here because we were meant to be, or because we had some special place in the universe, but that we simply crawled off the rocks by accident, trying to survive in a harsh and unforgiving environment. This philosophy was drawn from the theory of Neo-Darwinianism, and the philosophical implications of this theory was that there was no purpose or goals in the process of evolution. All life was believed to be the result of blind forces and accidental chances. If you were to rewind the tape of life back to zero and start over, you wouldn't get human life, or any of the variations of species we currently have. The random blind forces would produce something far different, because it was believed all life came about by chance or luck. However, in the past several decades, several important discoveries have been made. The Neo-Darwinian functionalist idea that life was simply the result of luck may not be entirely true. Mind-blowing discoveries have been made in physics, chemistry, and biology that are changing the way we view life, and a new structuralist paradigm is emerging. Many scientists have noted that Neo-Darwinian synthesis is incomplete and cannot adequately explain this new research, or explain how all life evolved. As Eugene Koonin said, "The edifice of the modern synthesis has crumbled, apparently beyond repair. The hallmark of the Darwinian discourse of 2009 is the plurality of evolutionary processes and patterns. Nevertheless, glimpses of a new synthesis might be discernible in emerging universals of evolution." A theory re-emerging today among many researchers is structuralism. Although we agree the idea of random heritable variations through adaptation is a driving force in evolution, structuralists argue it is not the only driving force or the main guiding principle. Structuralism is the idea that life is the result of natural laws, and not the byproduct of historical contingency or just chance genetic mutations. There is evidence of natural laws that guide and fine-tune evolution, and a wealth of data is now supporting this. Let's begin by going back to the beginning, before evolution began with the origin of life. For many decades, this problem has perplexed biologists. How could living things simply come out of non-living material? The odds of this happening by chance are astronomical. However, physicist Jeremy England may have found the answer. His work gained attention when he theorized life may be the inevitable result of thermodynamics. According to England and his co-researchers, atoms will naturally structure themselves and self-organize in order to deal with rare pockets of energy with low entropy states in the universe. Through computer simulations, England has shown that different chemicals organize and react with one another in order to better absorb incoming energy, like from the sun, and then dissipate it as heat. Typically, a system will settle into a state of equilibrium because of the second law of thermodynamics, like how our food will cool to room temperature. But in rare cases where there is low entropy, certain molecules will organize to fixed points far from equilibrium and keep absorbing the maximum amount of energy from the surrounding environment. England and Horowitz write these are rare states of extreme thermodynamic forcing, which might be recognized as examples of apparent fine-tuning. Self-replication may also be explained in that making copies of the same system will help absorb more of the incoming energy. As England said, a great way of dissipating more is to make more copies of yourself. However, such systems do resemble life, as we are consumers that burn through enormous amounts of energy. As Jeremy England says,
"You are more likely to land at very high forcing than if you were randomly throwing darts at chemical space." And so something in the dynamics here is indeed producing this tendency to acquire, in a sense, a highly cooperative, rare arrangement of chemicals that would look to us, if we were just walking along, so to speak, and picked up one of these systems, like many different chemical components are in an exquisitely rare arrangement that happens to be good at harvesting a rich energy source in the environment. So we think of this as sort of a prototypical example of a self-organized metabolism, where you can get something that looks like it has gotten better at eating from its environment over time with startling likelihood, even though you didn't a priori have any kind of selection pressure of the usual biological kind to carry you into a state like this.
So the very laws of physics tell us atoms will build certain structures in order to better process energy. And although England's work is still only in its beginning stages, it might be the first step in understanding how life arises. And if true, this would mean life arose as an inevitable result of natural laws. As England told Quanta in 2014, life should be as unsurprising as rocks rolling downhill. On top of this, many molecular and chemical processes necessary for life also seem to be the result of self-organization processes. Two chemists, Williams and Frosta de Silva, have argued thermodynamics and the rules of chemistry constrain and bring out an inevitable progression in evolution. They argue that there are principles of constraints within the nature of intercellular reductive chemistry, the challenge of oxygen, and the advantages of cooperative interactions within the context of ecosystems. These constraints lead to changes that were an inevitable progression and were not just due to blind chance. The more sophisticated organic chemistry, almost totally inside cells until humans evolved, is kinetically controlled and limited by the demands of cellular reduction necessary to produce essential chemicals and by the availability of certain elements and energy. They then conclude their paper by saying, life was in a physical tunnel and there was only one way to go. The evidence they offer shows the evolution of life was constrained from the very beginning to bring about certain results, meaning life would not be an accident but a product of the very laws of physics and chemistry. Many researchers have also noted that chemistry involved in the origin of metabolic processes was strongly constrained by natural forces. Eric Smith and Harold Morowitz go so far as to note that much of the biological order came from arrangement and augmentation from the underlying chemical world, and infer that this is strong evidence for a structuralist account of evolution. Martin Hanzik and his co-researchers have noted in experiments with just a few simple chemicals and an energy source, many lifelike features will arise through self-assembly.
This is how we could start to make a protocell. We use this idea called self-assembly. What that means is I can mix some chemicals together in a test tube in my lab, and these chemicals will start to self-associate to form larger and larger structures. Okay, so say on the order of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of molecules will come together to form a large structure that didn't exist before. And in this particular example, what I took is some membrane molecules, mixed those together in the right environment, and within seconds, it forms these rather complex and beautiful structures here. These membranes are also quite similar morphologically and functionally to the membranes in your body. So we came up with this protocell model here that I'm showing. We started with a natural occurring clay called montmorillonite. This is natural from the environment, this clay. It forms a surface that is, say, chemically active. It could run a metabolism on it. Certain kind of molecules like to associate with the clay. For example, in this case, RNA shown in red. This is a relative of DNA. It's an informational molecule. It can come along and it starts to associate with the surface of this clay. This structure then can organize the formation of a membrane boundary around itself. So it can make a body of lipid molecules around itself, and it's shown in green here on this micrograph. So just through self-assembly, mixing things together in the lab, we can come up with, say, a metabolic surface with some informational molecules attached inside of this membrane body. In this protocell model, it's just an oil droplet with a chemical metabolism inside that allows this protocell to use energy to do something, to actually become dynamic, as we'll see here. We add the droplet to the system, it's a pool of water, and the protocell starts moving itself around in the system, okay? Oil droplet forms through self-assembly, has a chemical metabolism inside, so it could use energy, and it uses that energy to move itself around in its environment. As we heard earlier, movement is very important in these kinds of living systems. It is moving around, exploring its environment, and remodeling its environment, as you see by these chemical waves that are forming by the protocell. So it's acting, in a sense, like a living system trying to preserve itself. We take this same moving protocell here, and we put it in another experiment, get it moving. Then I'm going to add some food to the system, and you'll see that in blue here. Right? So I add some food source to the system, the protocell moves, it encounters the food, It reconfigures itself and actually then is able to climb to the highest concentration of food in that system and stop there, right? So not only do we have this system that has a body, has a metabolism, it could use energy, it moves around, it can sense its local environment and actually find resources in the environment to sustain itself. Now, this doesn't have a brain, it doesn't have a neural system. This is just a sack of chemicals that is able to have this interesting and complex lifelike behavior.
On top of this, it has been demonstrated under plausible conditions in a prebiotic world that almost half of the amino acids essential for life can reliably come about from the laws of chemistry and physics. Another paper has demonstrated that a similar set of amino acids can be synthesized abiotically. This correlates to the work of several scientific papers on the nature and rise of protein folds. Biochemist Michael Denton reminds us life, as we know it, is in essence a protein-based phenomenon. Without the dozens of proteins we have, life would not exist. Many people assume these proteins evolved over time by chance chemical reactions, but several papers have argued many basic protein folds, which are necessary for life, are a natural product of amino acid assembly and constrained by a law-like behavior to form into specific biological structures necessary for life. For example, one paper has shown that multiple discoveries of the same fold have been found on different occasions, and that this indicates that higher order architecture of the folds is likely a non-contingent feature of nature. The evidence in several papers suggests that many aspects of proteins in molecular biology are functionally convergent and resulted from natural laws. Not that life happened upon them by chance, such as the intrinsic characteristics of the folds, the architectural diversity, marginal stability, robustness, and possession of a hydrophobic core. To highlight the research of another paper, Banavar and Maritan have shown that each protein does not fashion its own native state structure, but merely selects from the menu of predetermined folds. The laws of physics seem to have constrained protein folding. As they directly say, our work suggests an underlying stunning simplicity. Although sequences and functionalities of proteins evolve, the folds they adopted, which in turn determine function, seems to be determined by physical law and are not subject to Darwinian evolution. In that regard, these folds may be thought of as immutable or platonic. Protein folds do not evolve. Rather, the menu of possible folds is determined by physical law. Another paper says, from the outset, chemistry, in promoting structure, predetermines the universe of protein folds for polypeptide chains in an aqueous environment. The data has led many researchers, like W.R. Taylor, to put forward the idea that protein folds should be treated like the periodic table of elements, and that the 1,000 protein folds form another periodic table of basic crystal-like structures. So just like the laws of nature brought about the elements we have on the periodic table, so too has nature brought about the 1,000 basic protein folds, and they should be treated as emergent properties of matter. In one paper, notes we cannot discount the possibility that the same is true for RNA folds. There very well may be a finite set of natural forms for RNA that are predetermined by natural law-like behaviors. This fits with a study from 2009, which shows components of RNA, ribonucleotides, will self-assemble in nature. In an interview, researcher John Sutherland said, ribonucleotides are simply an expression of the fundamental principles of organic chemistry. Other studies have shown some success that activated ribonucleotides can polymerize to form simple RNA forms due to predetermined or finite boundaries. The chemical and molecular components necessary for life seem to be predetermined and constrained by nature and not happened upon by accident. We also find even more research of self-organization happening in other biological and chemical processes. Research has shown that simple peptides can self-assemble into nanotubes or vesicles, which would have provided a sort of primitive enclosure for early RNA-based enzymes or other primitive structures. Researcher Shengjiao Zhang says these lipid-like peptides can self-organize to form well-ordered nanostructures, including micelles, nanotubes, and nanovesicles in water. Furthermore, the structure formation is concentration dependent. Namely, at a low concentration, there are no defined structures. These structures spontaneously form at a critical aggression concentration. Studies have shown that chemical compounds, known as amphiphiles, can structurally self-organize in water. Micelles have been shown to self-replicate, and researcher Guy Arison says it happens by a process that resembles bacterial multiplication by budding. Within biological organisms, many self-organization structures have been observed. Self-organization has been seen in cellular order, specifically within the cytoarchitecture of retinal photoreceptors, as well as within microtubular forms. Another paper talks about how the optical cup self-organizes. In embryogenesis, Stuart Newman notes that the biological properties of cells generate complex biological structures, including major patterns of gastrulation. In another paper, Newman and Fott demonstrate that without the direction of genes, that several self-organization processes work together to mold cell masses into certain morphologies. There are in fact the common morphological motifs of all metazoan body plans and organ forms, both in the invertebrates and vertebrates, appearing repeatedly over the course of evolution, despite there frequently being no common ancestor between organisms with the same features. In other words, the same morphologies keep appearing in different organisms, despite them not being directed by genes. Nature appears to be fine-tuning or self-organizing so the same features appear in biology. Newman even directly says, this challenge does not outright abolish gradualist natural selection, but it does relegate it to a role in the fine-tuning and refining of heritable modification that arise by other, often physiologically based means. Thus it seems that self-organization processes, driven by natural laws, play a bigger role in the evolution of life as we know it. The evidence for structuralism was so overwhelming that even Stephen Jay Gould changed his views and became sympathetic to structuralism. He went so far as to say that from reading structuralist literature, that he developed some appreciation for the plausibility, or at least for the sheer intellectual power, of morphological explanations outside the domain of Darwinian functionalism. He also said he began to rethink some of his previous work. I worked piecemeal, producing a set of separate and continually accreting revisionary items along each of the branches of Darwinian central logic, until I realized that a Platonic something up there, in ideological space, could coordinate all these critiques and fascinations into a revised general theory with a retained Darwinian base. The prominent atheist Fred Hoyle once noted many biologists are willfully ignoring the mathematical improbabilities when they have claimed random mutational luck was the only cause of higher forms of life. The research from self-organization processes shows that adaptation is not the only driving force in evolution, and the new field of evolutionary developmental biology, or Evo-Devo for short, shows this as well. Evo-Devo researchers have presented evidence that new genes from adaptation are not the only driving forces in evolution, but ancient genes may very well be driving forces for body plans and morphological structures. The significance of this is simply that there is evidence of ancient structuralist body plans that would still be a major driving force in determining how the evolution of life plays out. Evo-Devo is the field of study that looks at the developmental processes of different organisms and infers ancestral relationships between how different creatures have evolved. And what they have found is there is evidence that aspects of body plans and morphological structures are driven not by new genes developed through adaptive means, but by ancient genes programmed to bring about certain body plans and features. As Rudolf Raff said, the conservation of a set of clustered genes over 500 million years is difficult enough to accept, but collinearity with body axis defies credibility, yet it's true. For example, there is a gene product commonly referred to as the sonic hedgehog protein, which has been responsible for the development of shark fins, as well as bird and mammal limbs. Neil Shubin remarked, "It means that the great evolutionary transformation, the evolution from fish fins into limbs, did not involve the origin of new DNA. Much of the shift likely involved using ancient genes, such as those involved in shark fin development, in new ways to make limbs with fingers and toes. But there is a deeper beauty to these experiments on limbs and fins. Tabin's lab used work in flies to find genes in chickens that tell us about human birth defects. Randy used the Tabin lab discovery to tell us something about our connection to skates. An inner fly helped find an inner chicken, which ultimately helped Randy find an inner skate. The connections among living creatures runs deep. Another study on the digit patterning in mice remarked, the periodic pattern of skeletal elements evidence in fins and mutant limbs strongly suggests that a self-organizing Turing-type mechanism of chondrogenesis is deeply conserved in vertebrate phylogeny. Researcher Sean Carroll has shown that an ancient gene plays a huge role in where an appendage in bilateral animals sprouts, whether it is a limb, wing, or antenna, and beyond this, there are dozens of other examples. What this all means is there is evidence of underlying primitive patterns that are a driving force in evolution. From the early fish limb, one could potentially predict the rise of future limbs of land animals. There are underlying features nature is fine-tuned to bring about. As Michael Denton noted, the discovery of the existence of such patterns in developmental modules being conserved in very distant organisms was entirely unexpected under the modern synthesis of neo-Darwinism, because it was believed that organisms were highly pliable adaptive assemblages of parts molded day by day, under the total control of natural selection. Every gene was thought to be recrafted and recrafted, including those involved in the assembly of body plans. In other words, it was thought there was no internal structuralist driving forces in evolution. Evolution was driven by external factors from the environment only. But research in Evo Devo does show there are internal structuralist factors driving evolution. As Michael Denton says, a new constraints paradigm among many Evo Devo researchers who acknowledge that the deep logic of development is bound to restrict the direction of variation and hence evolutionary change along limited paths. Evo Devo research has demonstrated ancient morphological structures are a driving force in evolution, cohering with the research of self-organization processes in biology, that nature is fine-tuned to bring about certain life forms as we now have them. Life, in the many forms that have been brought about, appear to be an inevitable result of the universe. This idea is only backed by the amount of convergence we have found in evolution. If nature is fine-tuned to bring about morphological structures and biological functions through long-lasting genes and self-organization, then we should expect to see the same forms repeating, and in fact we do. We have found dozens upon dozens of examples of convergence, when two organisms not closely related evolve the same traits, structures, or features. This has happened more times than one can count. Nature appears to constantly keep bringing out the same forms and structures in biology. Researchers William Dullman and Linda Trube have noted many amphibian animals have become terrestrial independently. Another study has found the same morphological complexity has evolved independently in multiple lines within crustaceans. The same features seem to keep arising within this specific taxon. Two completely different types of frogs appear convergent in several ways, even though they are not closely related. Both evolved to arrive at the same form convergently, and not even on the same continent. And within frogs, antimicrobial, peptide-based defenses have evolved independently at least 3 times. The morphological structure of the toad has also evolved multiple times. Elizabeth Panizzi says, in 2009, using a combination of nuclear and mitochondria DNA, Van Boxleer and her colleagues built a family tree that encompasses 86 toad species. Until that time, most systematists assumed that the Buffo genus of so-called true toads belonged on the same branch. But they didn't fall together, Bossowit recalls. Instead, this quintessential toad form has emerged multiple times on multiple evolutionary branches. Within birds, the Petui genus has evolved the same traits independently. One study says, interestingly, the 6 Petui species appear to have evolved convergently in a number of important characteristics. There appears to be general convergent evolution in coloration, size, morphology, and behavior, as well as in toxicity. We also see praying mantis morphology has evolved independently at least 6 times. a hyena-like ecomorph that specializes in bone cracking, has also evolved independently 6 times. Sang and Wang say the overarching pattern of convergence is quite clear. Looking at cats specifically, we have seen saber-toothed forms have evolved independently several times, and cat-like morphologies have come about not just on the feline family, but have been observed in the canine family. Many people are familiar with the cheetah, but are unaware there was once an American cheetah that was almost identical to the African cheetah in structure and form. Daniel Adams writes, "The points of similarity are so extensive and of such a complex nature that a hypothesis attributing their pricing to other than common genetic descent would require pushing the concept of parallel evolution to an unprecedented extreme." We have seen so many examples of convergent evolution, it would take hours to go over every example. Like how the 3-toed sloth and the 2-toed sloth are not closely related, but have evolved to look and act almost identical, or how the hummingbird has evolved the same structure as the hawk moth. The same morphological structures have appeared many times, and convergence in evolution has manifested in many other ways. Like the independent evolution in different species of features like retractable necks, the labral tooth, ant mimicry, carapace shells, tetradetoxin resistance, elastic proteins, ballistic arrangements, lunglessness, suction feeding, durophagy, mouth brooding, filter feeding, and many other dozens of examples. I've barely scratched the surface on the hundreds of examples of convergence we find in the evolution of life. We find so much I purposefully handicap myself by not mentioning most of the examples of convergence I gave in a video from 6 months ago. So if you want to see even more examples of convergence from several researchers, see this video. And even with that, there are still more examples of even more convergence Simon Conway Morris lists in his books. His book, The Runes of Evolution, is a 300-page book of countless examples of convergence. So much convergence in evolution happens, I've only mentioned about a fraction of all the cases in both videos combined. Nature keeps arriving at the same solutions, which makes sense if life was finely tuned by the universe to bring about the structures and features of life as we know them. The evidence implies the way life evolved was expected the moment the universe began. This is why a recent study from last year in the International Journal of Astrobiology suggests that alien life, if we ever encounter it, will have similar forms to what we find on Earth. The same processes that led to human life would lead to very similar life on any other planet. As Sam Levin says, past approaches in the field of astrobiology have been largely mechanistic, taking what we see on Earth and what we know about chemistry, geology, and physics to make predictions about aliens. By predicting that aliens undergone major transitions, which is how complexity has arisen in species on Earth, we can say that there is a level of predictability to evolution that would cause them to look like us. In other words, evolution is so predictable and constrained by nature that we can infer life on other planets would likely turn out the same way or with similar forms. As Robert Barry remarked, if we ever succeeded in communicating with conceptualizing beings in outer space, they won't be spheres, pyramids, cubes, or pancakes. In all probability, they will look an awful lot like us. The evolution of life doesn't seem to be dumb luck on a backwater planet, but a direct result of natural laws. The multitude of forms of life we see don't seem to be contingent assemblies, but as much a part of the universe as the laws of physics and chemistry are. But if this is true, and life in its multitude of constrained forms are embedded in the fabric of the universe, much like the periodic table is, then the philosophical implications for our existence may be more interesting than we realize, as Edward T. Oakes notes in Fitness of the Cosmos for Life. We can see that the more complex organisms become, the more intelligence grows. As we discussed in our last video, high levels of intelligence have evolved multiple times in species widely separated. Some researchers, like Nicola Clayton, have gone so far as to say that corvids have experienced convergent mental evolution with primates. Martin Moynihan says of capuchins that they can cope with some classes of stimuli with remarkable ingenuity, almost unparalleled below the level of man himself. Lori Marino says that humans and cetaceans represent two fundamentally different cortical organization themes, and thus compels the conclusion that any similar complex cognitive processes between primates and cetaceans are convergent. The evolution of intelligence seems to be another inevitable result of nature itself. Human intelligence may very well also be an inevitable consequence of natural law, and humans might very well be the end goal. Dr. Michael Hoffman has argued the data shows human intelligence would not increase with brain size. In other words, if our brains were to get any bigger, information processing would slow down. We seem to have reached the peak of intelligence in terms of evolutionary development. Any increase in brain size would decrease intelligence, just like a decrease in brain size would also decrease intelligence.
We did a study by comparing brain structures in primates, starting from very small, relatively primitive primates up to human beings. What you can do then is to extrapolate these findings to creatures which even have a larger brain than we had. To our surprise, after a particular brain size, something strange happened. There is some maximum in intelligence, in processing power, in cognitive abilities, but beyond that point, you find a decrease in number of structures in the brain. It will go along with a decrease in processing power and information processing, and therefore also with intelligence.
We seem to have reached the pinnacle, or perhaps the goal, of intelligence in the evolution of life. Biologically speaking, Hoffman's research suggests our brains cannot increase our intelligence if they were to grow in size. So we might have reached the highest peak of intelligence in terms of what is possible with biological evolution. So going on this, Edward Oakes asks, if intelligence is well nigh inevitable, then does such an inevitability say something about the inherent nature of the universe? If we were so inevitable from the start, why the paroxysms of self-abasement about our fluke emergence? In other words, life could not have emerged unless the environment was fit for it, and that implies the environment was supposed to bring about life and eventually intelligence. And philosophically, that would suggest it quite possibly is wrong to say we are an insignificant fluke. Instead, our existence may have been more inevitable than we realize. Oakes then takes this one step further. Because Darwinism gave a new explanation for how and why each organism is so well adapted to its environment, the record of convergence, similar organs such as eyes and wings developing independently across many phyla and species, surely must say something as well about the environment. In other words, the fact that so many biological forms developed photosensitive cells and then eyes also testifies to the ubiquity of light. Just as the fact that wings developed independently on insects, birds, bats, some dinosaurs, and so forth testifies to the density and viscosity of the atmosphere of the Earth. So too with complex brains, to be adaptive, brains have to evolve in response to the environment. Or as I have argued elsewhere, if wings evolved against and in response to air, and eyes against and in response to light, then brains must evolve against and in response to something like mental air. By that admittedly metaphorical term, I mean those a priori ideal structures already part of the universe that make a mathematical capable brain possible in the first place. In other words, Darwinism not only is compatible with Platonism, it presupposes it. Basically, the whole point is the evolution of intelligence presupposes there is a mental world that needs to be understood and comprehended. The evolution of the brain is in response to an environmental reality embedded with abstract and universals, which we find in mathematics and logic, and in a sense brings about creatures to comprehend such universal concepts. Even Daniel Dennett admitted, suppose SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, struck it rich, and established communication with intelligent beings on another planet. We would not be surprised to find that they understood and used the same arithmetic that we do. Why not? Because arithmetic is right. The point is clearly not restricted to arithmetic, but to all necessary truths, what philosophers since Plato have called a priori knowledge. As Minsky says, we can't expect certain a priori structures to appear, almost always, whenever a computation system evolves by selection from a universe of possible processes. It has often been pointed out that Plato's curious theory of reincarnation and reminiscence, which he offers as an explanation of the source of our a priori knowledge, bears a striking resemblance to Darwin's theory, and this resemblance is particularly striking from our current vantage point. Darwin himself famously noted the resemblance in a remark in one of his notebooks, commenting on the claim that Plato thought our necessary ideas arise from the pre-existence of the soul. Darwin wrote, "Read monkeys for pre-existence." If this is the case, then the evidence in the evolution of life would infer that just like eyes evolved several times in response to the constraints of light, and wings evolved several times in response to environmental pressures, then intelligent brains would have to evolve in response to universal information of mathematics, logic, universal truths, and so on. As Dennett pointed out, the universal mental abstract world selected through fine-tuning in the environment to bring about the eventual rise of intelligent creatures. Mathematics is so embedded in the fabric of reality. Intelligence evolved in response to comprehending such abstractions. As Oakes concludes, to put the matter perhaps less metaphorically, no intelligence without intelligibility, or more exactly, no evolved intelligence without a prior environmental intelligibility. I admit that the logic of this argument leads to the dread spectrum of idealism, which posits that ideal realities such as numbers, logic, and forms precede and determine material realities. If I am right that science finds itself regularly bumping into metaphysics, and evolution means that the information of the environment is always being read into the organism so that one can read back what the environment must have been like based solely on the information in the organism, then I see no alternative but to hold that reality is first ideal before it is material. In other words, the evolution of life infers an idealist picture of reality. The ideal forms of life are so embedded and predictable in the very nature and laws of the universe that they precede and give rise to the material forms we experience. The universe must have mental aspects like universal truths, and those must precede the physical, so physical brains can evolve in response to such things. Life results as it has because life as we know it was part of the fabric of nature, as much of the elements of matter are. From the start of the universe, one could predict the periodic table, given what we know about the laws of physics. And likewise, one could see that the universe was designed to give rise to forms of life as we know it. And furthermore, the truths of mathematics and logic bring about the existence of intelligent life the same way, as brains evolve against and in response to universal truths. Thus, the information reality precedes the material reality, as objective idealism predicts. Life was inevitable because, in a sense, it was programmed into the universe. The odds of life happening were 100% the moment the Big Bang happened. And given that there might be about 60 billion potential planets just in our galaxy that could give rise to life, I would predict based on what we know, with self-organization processes, the extraordinary high level of convergence and evolution, and how ideal universals would necessarily give rise to intelligence, that our galaxy and the universe itself is teeming with intelligent life, brought about not as an insignificant accident, but as the goal of the universe. You are not here by chance, but here because you are meant to be.